In example 3, we're going to be looking at the graph in order to find the A, B, C, and D values and write the equation. So our first step is always to first draw the axis. And the way we know that we've drawn our axis in the right place is that the distance above and below the axis is the same. So since this is -3 and the axis is at -4, it looks like it goes up a half and then down a half. So my A value is up 1/2 and down 1/2. And so my A value then is going to be a half. I am going to go ahead and I'm going to divide this because I need to write an equation for both sine as well as for cosine. And so my A value is a half for both. They're always the same. I'm always going to assume that my amplitude is positive. I'm always going to have, I'm not going to look at my negative sine or cosine. I'm just always going to assume that my amplitude is positive when I'm looking at these graphs. All right, so I've drawn my axis. I'm going to go ahead and label those key points. And then I'm going to go ahead and remember that sine always starts on the axis and goes up. So this would be a starting place for sine. So with this, this, and this. I think it's very obvious that this is my closest starting place for sine. And I'm going to say on these graphs that you're either on the mark or halfway. We're not going to say, oh, it looks like it's a third of the way or a fourth of the way. So when I kind of look here, it's definitely not at the pi/4, which means it's halfway. So half of pi/4 would be pi/8. So it's moved to the right. Pi/8 is how it's moved, which means my C value is going to be negative pi/8. So I want to make sure that whatever the phase shift is, that my C value is the opposite of that. The other thing I need to figure out, the D value is wherever my axis was, and my axis was moved down to 4, so -4, because that was moved down 4. I want you to see that these match up, because Y tells the truth. These should always be the opposite. Right. Now, probably the part that people struggle with the most is figuring out the period, and from that period figuring out the B value. So I need to look at going from one starting point to another, what my full sine curve would take. So I look here, and sometimes what I have to do is maybe, I don't always use the one that I'm using. Sometimes I could use this sine curve here, I could use this sine curve here, whichever one I want to do. All right, so I know that this starts at pi/8, and it looks like it goes right here in the middle here. So I'm going from pi/8, and let's see, between pi/2 and 3 pi/4. I could figure out what is in between there, or I could say, okay, I know what this one is, and I could go from here to here. Another thing I can do is I can figure out half of the sine curve and double it. So I just want you to know, I think the reason this is the most challenging part is there's lots of ways to do it. I'm not just going to say, do this and you'll get your answer. Probably on one like this, because this goes from pi/8 and I would say then that this is negative pi over 8. This is half of the sine curve is here, and then this is the other half. I would probably just say, well, what's this half? And I would double it, because this is half of the sine curve. So whatever that is, if I double it, that's my full sine curve. So when I have pi over 8 and pi over 8, because the distance from here to here, so I'm right now, just want to make sure I'm clear at what I'm measuring. I'm going to show you this. Okay, sorry. From here to here. I'm figuring out what that distance is. And this is pi over 8, and this is pi over 8. An eighth and an eighth is 2/8 or 1/4. So 1/4 of a pi, if I double that, that becomes 1/2 of a pi. So from here to here and here to here gives me 1/4, which means this must also be 1/4 to have a full sine curve. A fourth and a fourth is a half. So 2 pi over b equals the period, which is pi over 2. So 2 pi over b equals pi over 2. I can cross multiply. And I get b pi equals 4 pi. Well, there's a pi on each side. You divide both sides by pi, they cancel, and b is 4. I want to show you something else. Just because we were looking at the sine curve doesn't mean we needed to use the sine curve to find the period. Remember that sine and cosine have the same period. I could have used cosine, and it would have been easier, because it's very obvious here that the cosine curve starts at negative pi over 4, and it goes to positive pi over 4. And I know that this is a fourth of a pi and a fourth of a pi, which is a half of a pi. So in this instance, it would have been easier to use cosine to figure out the period. So I don't want you to feel like, oh, well, if I'm finding the sine curve, I have to use sine. You can use cosine, because this one is right on this mark. I know from here to here is a fourth, and from here to here is a fourth, and 1/4 plus 1/4 is 1/2. Just wanted to show you that. All right, so now that I have, I'm going to move this value over. I don't know why I wrote it in the middle there. There are my a, b, c, and d values for sine. So I can write my equation y equals 1/2 times the sine of 4 times x minus pi over 8 minus 4. Right, now let's do cosine. Notice the a value is going to be the same. The d value is the same because I've moved down to 4. And the period is the same for sine and cosine, so my b value is also 4. The only part that's different for cosine is how it's shifted left or right. Well, as I go through and I look at my cosine curve, these two are both the same distance from my starting point. Remember, this is always where I want to look to be starting. I'll highlight that in pink. This is where I would normally start my sine or cosine, which is why this star was closest for sine. These are both pi over 4 away. So these are the same. So this would be left or right pi over 4, which is plus or minus pi over 4. And when I go to write my equation, I get y equals 1/2 times the cosine of 4 times x plus or minus pi over 4 minus 4. Those are my two equations for letter A. All right, let's go to letter B. So for letter B, again, the first thing I always have to do is draw my axis. I see that this goes from 0 to 4, so 2 would be halfway. So there's my axis. I'm also going to go ahead and set this up for sine and cosine. Okay. All right. Next thing I'm going to do is draw all my key points. And then my starting points. Remember, for cosine, they're up top. And for sine, they're on the axis, and then they're going up. Okay, so my closest cosine is here. My closest sine, these look like they're the same. And now I'm ready to start filling in all of my values. So A, my amplitude, I'm 2 up and I'm 2 down. So 2 is my amplitude for both. I'm going to do the B value last because it takes the most work. D, I can see that my axis is at positive 2, up 2. So it's 2. Right, for sine, I'm left and right pi over 2. Which means I'm plus or minus pi over 2. For cosine, I'm, let's see, this is halfway, so half of a half is a quarter. So I'm left pi over 4, which would be plus pi over, plus or minus, all right, plus pi over 4, because remember, this is with x, so it lies. It says left, so the C value is actually plus. My B value is where I'm going to need to figure out the period. So I'm going to look at this and say, well, I can see that with sine, this is pi over 2, and this is pi over 2. So a half of a pi and a half of a pi is a whole pi. So that's probably, I would use the sine curve. If I used cosine, I would say, okay, well, I have a quarter, and then this would be 3/4. A quarter and 3/4 is also a whole pi. So my period is pi. So 2 pi over b equals pi. Now I can tell from looking at this, 2 divided by 2 would just give me pi on the left. So I can tell that my b value would be 2. If you don't see that, then put your 1 and cross multiply. I'm going to do my work up top here, and it would be 2 pi equals b pi. Solving for b, divide both sides by pi. B equals 2, and it's the same for both. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and write my equation. This would be y equals 2 times the sine of 2 times x plus or minus pi over 2 plus 2. That's a plus. For cosine, it's going to be y equals 2 times the cosine of 2 times x plus pi over 4 plus 2. We have one more example, but I think we're going to have to do that on our next video because we won't have enough time.